Hello, everybody. I hope everyone is bearing up under this, not exactly blizzard, but a lot of snow for sure. Good morning. It is Friday. Just wanted to basically lay out what it is that we're going to want to focus on over the course of this last week. Leading up to our final class. I appreciate you guys being flexible last night. Like I said, I know a couple of people had contacted me with some concerns about the weather, which were justified, I think, because it would have been snowing pretty hard by the time we got out, at least down here. So I got the okay to go ahead and do everything online this week, which is great. I hope that's okay for everyone. I hope it's convenient enough and whatnot. I will have your I've been making my notes and whatnot and such on your informative presentations from last week, and I'll have those grades posted probably on Sunday, I think. I'm going to be kind of out of action tomorrow, but on Sunday I should have those up there so you can get some feedback kind of on certain elements of those presentations as we go into the persuasive presentations. Let's see. What we were going to cover this week, and what I want to cover this week, and what I would like you to cover this week, would be a lot of things just kind of, I think, by way of review. We've talked about a lot of stuff over the course of these scant few weeks we've been together. Certainly covered almost as much in the book, albeit quite faster than we normally would in a 10-week version of this course. But I think we've hit on certainly the most important elements of public speaking that you need to think about, of gathering research, of all the elements that you kind of need to think about. I think the main thing to focus on, based on the informative presentations that I saw, as well as just kind of generally going forward, I said it in the first week, and it continues to be true. I think the most important thing to focus on in any kind of public speaking situation, besides obviously organization and research and the overall credibility of whatever it is you're presenting, is your audience. And that doesn't come as any great shock to anyone, I don't think. But it really is something you kind of need to keep thinking about as you move through the process of putting together any kind of presentation for whatever purpose. The audience is always going to be the most important thing. So, for example, we talked about the need for objectivity. I think that's something you really want to continue keeping in mind. You really want to make sure that you're not, in an informative or a persuasive presentation, that you're not inserting yourself into the presentation. Your personal experience, your personal opinion, your personal insights. The kind of thing like, I know when this happens to me, blank, that's the kind of thing you want to leave out of a presentation like that, unless that's the goal. If the goal is that you're talking about yourself or your experience, certainly that's okay. But in a general situation where you're presenting, information or a persuasive argument or anything like that, you really want to make sure that you're taking yourself out of the equation, and that you're focusing solely on the research, because that way, at the very least, you can assume that there's going to be some element of what it is that you're talking about that will resonate with the audience. And if you're only talking about yourself or your experience, you have no guarantee of that. So I think that would be one of the biggest things. Avoid personal inferences, avoid, personal insights, arguing points based on your personal experience with the situation. It would be the kind of thing where if I said, well, I think that, whatever, weekly meetings at a job are stupid because I know when we have our weekly meetings, this person always talks and nothing gets done. That's not relevant to an audience, right? So you want to make sure that you're presenting objective information always. And that's just kind of the guiding principle of public speaking, I think, in general, is kind of being aware of your audience. So to that end, what I would like you to review this week, and I'll post a couple of additional resources as we move through the weekend and into the beginning of next week, kind of leading up to our last class. I'd like you to review, certainly as you're putting together your persuasive outline, review the CRAP test for credibility. Make sure that your sources are my finger was gigantic there. Make sure that your sources are, that they're credible, that you've done the due diligence to ensure that the authors, the sources, the websites, whatever they are credible. That's really the most important aspect of anything involving research. If you can kind of get into a habit of doing that in general, you'll be in good shape. So obviously you want to review that as you're putting together your sources. I think it's really important, in particular, with the persuasive speech, you really want to be sure that you're aware of those logical fallacies we talked about last week. The whole issue of being able to identify when there's some sort of flaw in an argument, a logical flaw in an argument. Again, we talked about this last week, but, logical fallacies are something that only over time are you going to get really adept at identifying. It's not the kind of thing where you're going to suddenly one day be like, oh, there's a slippery slope argument, and this person said that, and it's this. Over time, I think you'll kind of, once you start looking for those kind of flaws in arguments, you'll be able to identify them. So don't feel like you suddenly have to be some expert in this. But at the very least, you want to make sure that, if something someone says in a source that you're using or something like that seems a little, maybe it is a little. Maybe you want to vet that, right? And I know that was a very clear way of if it seems, yeah. But you know what I mean. I mean, based on what we talked about last week, with regard to the way that logical fallacies work, they're designed. They're often not malicious, and they're not necessarily. The intention is not necessarily to mislead an audience. But very often, just because, if you're dealing with an emotional topic or something that resonates with people, or, and you see these kinds of emotional appeals a lot, after a tragedy, things like that. So it's by no means to say that these are, logical fallacies appear in arguments for nefarious, evil reasons. It just happens to be the way things are sometimes. But that doesn't change the fact that they can weaken an argument. So you want to make sure that you really have that under control. My little finger is determined to keep coming into the camera there. So in terms of the other things that I would like you to review that we would have reviewed in class last night. So the crap test, number one, the credibility of any source, right? Number two, logical fallacies and flaws in argument. And I think if you just kind of review chapter 15 on understanding argument, I think that'll really help. Most of that chapter is stuff that we covered last week. But there are a few things in there that I think would really, you would benefit from some further review just for the sake of kind of having it under your belt. And then additionally, I'd like you to review chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 just deals with using language effectively. And this was something we were going to talk about last night, although we were going to talk about it in kind of general terms. So I have no real issue with you, going through the chapter on your own and kind of just reading through it. But this chapter 10 kind of gives you an indication of basically how you want to think about what you're saying. If that sounds vague, but it really is just, it kind of gives you some perspective on how you want to approach the things you say and how you want to think about language in terms of relating it to an audience, right? And I think this is something, again, it's not a skill that you suddenly develop like some genius overnight. It's not the kind of thing where you're suddenly, going to get thrust into a room full of people and every word that comes out of your mouth is going to be perfect. That's not reality, and that's not the way. We are as humans. But being aware of kind of the nuance of your audience and the way that you're talking to them, the things that you're saying, the kind of all the classic things that you want to avoid in professional or academic writing are similar in terms of what you want to avoid or focus on, alternately, in public speaking. For example, it's obviously a big no-no in academic and professional writing to use slang. You don't want to use slang. For a couple of reasons. A, it's not professional. B, your audience isn't necessarily going to know what you mean, right? I mean, slang is one of those things, it's a cultural thing that changes very quickly, right? Showing my age. But when I was a kid, we used to use, using the phrase "oh, something's bad" meant it was cool, right? It was actually good. That would be completely lost on people now. That would have no bearing on anyone outside of the Michael Jackson album. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about with regard to slang. Is you want to be very careful of how it connects with an audience, because it likely won't. And you want to be really careful of that when you're speaking in any sort of academic or professional situation. Now, I mean, obviously, there are exceptions to every rule. If you're speaking to a room full of, if you're a high school teacher and you know what certain slang terms mean, yeah, obviously your students are going to know what that means too. But in general, it's a very slippery slope. Logical fallacy. It's a very slippery slope to assume that because one reference to slang might be taken in kind of a comedic way, that suddenly you can start interjecting your presentations with slang. You want to avoid that. And that's just one consideration. Slang is the obvious one because it's easy and everyone's kind of aware of it. But there are a lot of considerations with regard to language that you really want to think about. There are going to be differences if you're speaking to a room full of people from a specific culture. I had to give a brief presentation a few months back to a group of Chinese delegates that came to John Marshall, and basically wanted information about our online program. Well, some of that was through a translator. Some of them spoke English well. Some of them really didn't. And so that was a challenge, and that was a cultural consideration I had to make when it came down to how I was going to present information, because the way the internet functions in China is very different from the way that it operates here in America, right? So there were certain things that I would normally take for granted in explaining to a group of people about how our technology worked, about how computers worked, about how online classes functioned, that I couldn't take for granted with that group of people because they didn't have the same kind of experience that I did. So those are the kinds of things that Chapter 10 explores, with just the idea of using language effectively and basically figuring out what's going to communicate my point to my audience in the most functional way, right? And the things we've been talking about obviously all tie into that, and we've been talking about the issue of language, for the last few weeks, so I'm sure none of this comes as any great surprise, but it is kind of, language is really ultimately what's going to connect you with an audience, so a big part of audience awareness is the kind of language that you're using, right? And that comes down to, citing sources in your speech. You don't want to just leave that completely on the table. Say, according to the study in 2016, et cetera, that sort of a thing. You want to cite sources when it's possible in a speech like that so that people know where the information comes from, right? Let me see. I'm consulting my notes here. I also have a snow day, so I'm at home, as you can see. Got the Lambert's mug. Lambert's Cafe in Sikeston, Missouri, if you've never been there. Home of throwed rolls. It's a lot of fun. They just pitch rolls across the dining room. You should, if you haven't been there, you should make it a goal. So the other chapter that we were going to look at last night is Chapter 11. And Chapter 11 deals primarily with presentation media. Now, again, this is one of those things that I don't spend a lot of time on Chapter 11 normally for a variety of reasons. I think it's important to kind of review it and get a sense of the general considerations that they're making with regard to giving presentations. I think, though, presentation media is something that, kind of like slang and language, changes a lot and very quickly, right? I go to conferences every year for work, tech conferences and education, technology and education and that sort of a thing. And I can't tell you the number of vendors, that will be there with some, new video conference solution or new way of doing this or new way of organizing your spreadsheets or, whatever it is. I cannot tell you the number of vendors that will be different from year to year because they come and go so quickly, right? This flashy, amazing web conferencing solution over here, 1 year, well, in a year's time, that company might get bought by someone else and cease to exist completely, right? So presentation media is one of those things that, and I said this a couple of weeks ago, and I stand by it, I think you want to be very careful about the use of presentation media. Now, that said, obviously, it's things like, graphics and things like that. Those are always acceptable, and those are always reasonable in any context you want to present them. What I'm referring to with regard to presentation media and kind of how you want to approach it is you don't want to rely so heavily on your media materials that either failure in technology, which we talked about, and hopefully wouldn't happen, but you never know. You wouldn't want to rely so heavily on the media presentation part of this, of any speech or of any presentation, because the technology can fail, but also because people learn in different ways, and this kind of gets into the whole idea of learning styles. Some people are visual learners, some people are textual learners, some people retain information by reading it in a textbook and making their own notes, and the process of writing that out is what actually helps them retain it. Some people are the same way with seeing visual material, right? They need some sort of visual lesson to understand fully what it is they're supposed to be taking away from something. So everyone learns a little bit differently. And it's important when you're using presentation media to kind of keep that in mind. You don't want to overload the audience with images or with text, certainly not with text. I would say the biggest thing to avoid with presentation media, and you'll see this in the textbook, they talk about it, is too much text on a slide is going to go right over your audience's head, right? They're at a certain point, you don't want to have to fight for their attention, I guess is the thing that you want to think about. And if you use a lot of visuals, really flashy stuff, and there's a ton of text on your slides. It's this beautiful presentation, but there's so much happening on the screen. That's going to distract an audience from what you're saying, right? They're going to be focusing on that presentation. They may not be focusing as much on you, right? So if the goal is to get them to pay attention to the information on the slides, great. And if that's integrated into your presentation in such a way that you can say, on this slide we see blank, blank, and blank, great. But just be aware of the fact that too much in a presentation, too much text, too many pictures, too many formatting changes, that sort of a thing, that's the kind of thing that's going to distract your audience away from what you're saying. So, and the biggest takeaway in chapter 11 is the idea of kind of figuring out a balance, right? And again, not something that happens overnight, but it's fair to suggest that, you want to start out pretty simple, and I think the presentations that we saw, last week, the visual elements in those were good examples, I think, and those were effective. Katrina had the graphical representation of how much time we spend at work. That was a really nice visual to accompany what she was saying. Well done, Katrina. That was a nice visual because it gave us something to look at that kind of it presented the gravity of the argument to the audience, in a way that was easily identifiable, right? The pictures of animals interacting with people. That Leah presented, that was great too, because those kind of gave some indications of the scenarios that she was talking about. It wasn't too much. It wasn't something that the audience had to focus all their attention on, but it was a nice visual accompaniment to what you were saying. So things like that are perfectly reasonable. I had a student a couple of terms ago who literally had her entire presentation word for word in her slideshow. And I'm not kidding you. It was like an 11-point font, and they were about, this was several terms ago, so it's fine. There were about 10 points, bullet points on the slide, and it was literally word for word. She was reading it, which you want to avoid anyway. But yeah, every single piece of information in the entire presentation was on that slide. That is too much. You don't want that, and you don't need it. Because the goal is you want the audience listening to you, right? You want them paying attention to what you're saying and the message that you're presenting. And if they're so focused on, am I supposed to be reading all of this on the slide? Is this just kind of for supplemental purposes? You run the risk of kind of throwing the audience off a little bit. So you want to really avoid that, because that could be a pitfall. So review chapter 11. Take it with a grain of salt with regard to the references to specific types of presentation media and things like that. Not everything, is going to be applicable in every situation. So they talk a little bit about web conferencing and things like that. And we talked about that, I think, in week 1 or week 2 possibly. Just the idea of, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week too after our presentations, just by way of kind of wrapping up. The pitfalls sort of, or the challenges, I guess is the better way to put it, of distance presentation, right? Of the web conference, of digital communication, texting, social media, all of these sorts of communication that are perfectly legitimate, but they may not communicate certain key elements of conversation or of interaction that you really kind of need in some situations, right? I can't read body language, in a text. I can't see if someone's, frustrated, or if someone's, I can tell if someone's happy or really angry based on what they're saying, right? But body language and tone, sarcasm, things like that, those things don't necessarily communicate well over text-based, communication. So there are a lot of elements, like we talked about with distance communication, that really they can be problematic. And I told the story, I think, in week 1 or week 2 about the student who thought I was mad at her all term because I ended all of my sentences with periods. It's like, no, I'm an English teacher. Of course I ended them with periods. But she didn't really, that was a perfect example of how she was unable, based on her experience or based on how she communicated digitally, she was unable to read my tone as a result. And that's a risk you run. And once again, that all comes back to audience, right? You can know exactly what you intend in a text message to a friend if you're having a disagreement or something like that. But you got to remember, what you intend is not necessarily how that person is taking it in, right? And because they're taking it in through their own filter. You want to think about it the same thing about the audience when you're presenting anything. Right, a speech, a persuasive speech, something at work, whatever. You want to kind of bear that in mind. Is my argument, are my main ideas presented in such a way that I can reasonably assume how the audience is going to take the information? And that's probably the most key element you want to consider when you're going through this process of putting together your persuasive outline and arguing your main ideas, is the information you're presented in such a way that you've, at least as much as you can, eliminated the possibility of the audience misinterpreting your ideas, taking them the wrong way, misunderstanding your tone, that sort of a thing. That's kind of the goal. If you can work toward making sure that you have your argument and your main ideas and your research and everything like that presented in such a way to the audience that at the very least there's not going to be any confusion about what you intended, that's what you want. And of course, the other big thing with the persuasive essay, persuasive outline, as well, is that you want to avoid any sort of personal opinion or personal experience. That nothing will kill an argument faster in an academic or professional context than injecting your opinion into it. It's just the way it is, and this is something I go around and around with people. And the reason I said essay is because this is probably the biggest thing I have to reiterate in composition classes when we're working on a research paper that's based entirely in research, which this speech should be. Your persuasive speech should be rooted in research. That's the point, right? And we talked about that a couple weeks ago. And last week as well, the need for it to be objective. It doesn't mean that it's not arguing your stance. If I'm in favor of stronger gun control laws or stronger gun laws, okay, that's my opinion. I think they should be stronger, or I don't think they should be stronger, whatever it is, right? But it's my job then as the writer and the presenter to present that opinion in an unbiased fashion, right? So it's one thing for me to get up and say, I think laws should be changed because of this, and I think this because I think that blank, 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 whatever, not acceptable. Because to that audience who doesn't know me, my opinion is meaningless, right? But if I can say, all right, here's my opinion, here's the research that agrees with me, essentially, and here's the research that says, some analyst or something says, yes, here's why we need stronger gun control laws. This person's a respected professional in their field. Maybe they're a sociologist or, whatever, a cop, whatever it is. If I can use that person as the springboard for my argument, according to so-and-so and so-and-so, we need stronger gun control laws because of X, Y, and Z, right? And that's the crucial difference. And you want to make sure that in any persuasive scenario like that, unless the goal is to present your opinion, which this is not, you always want to leave your opinion out of it. There should be no I statements, no first person, right? No second person. No, you should do this. No, I think that we need blank, blank, blank. Well, it sounds blunt, but it's true. In an objective scenario where you're speaking to potentially to a room full of coworkers or strangers even, your opinion is irrelevant, right? It's how well you can support the ideas in your opinion with research. And that's the crucial element that you want to focus on here. And that can be a challenge. I understand that can be a challenge. So to that end, if you have questions over the course of this weekend, anything, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to discuss at length. I'm happy to meet up if, I'm right downtown. So if you're at National Louis and you're having a crisis and you want to sit down and talk about stuff, I'm happy to grab a cup of coffee or come over to National Louis and meet with you for a little bit. That's fine. I'm around downtown anyway. So if anything comes up as you're drafting this over the course of the week, and the weekend, feel free to reach out, let me know. I realize I've kind of thrown a lot at you, so to recap, you're going to want to review the research process that we talked about for the informative speech, the CRAP test, the OWL Purdue site, so you put everything in APA format the way we talked about, the need for structure and organization in your outline, like we discussed, which I think everyone pretty much has a handle on at this point, which is great. Be sure that you're citing sources in the body of your outline. That's important. For your persuasive outline, it should be at least three sources, okay? Or 2 to 3 sources, I believe I said last week, so we'll keep it at that. 2 to 3 sources, at least, okay, at a minimum. It does require visuals. This one requires visuals of some kind. So I'm not going to put a lot of parameters on you as far as what I expect in terms of visuals. I've given you some info. Please do review Chapter 10 and Chapter 11 over the course of the weekend or the week as you're composing your outline and practicing your speech. But those elements are important. I think it's important to start learning how to use visual media in an effective way. So the visual presentation is a requirement of the persuasive speech. And then, at least 2 to 3 sources to support it. The outline, just as with the informative essay, needs to be in APA format. You need to cite your sources in the body of the outline. The sources themselves need to be properly structured as references, right, in APA format. And the outline should be in complete sentences. So the guidelines are basically the same for the persuasive outline as they were for the informative outline. I will have all of your grades updated hopefully by Wednesday, so you know kind of exactly where you stand going into, well, not hopefully by Wednesday, definitely by Wednesday. So you'll kind of know where you are going into this final speech. And then next week we'll start off with the speeches. We'll get those out of the way so you're not sitting on pins and needles for the whole time. And then we'll just kind of close out by recapping some of the key points, kind of the key elements, and kind of some of the things that I see as maybe areas to focus on going forward out of the class and you know, speaking situations outside of our very brief but hopefully effective course. So with that in mind, like I said, I'm happy to post resources of any kind if people need more guidance, if you'd like, you know, more information on APA format, anything at all that you might want more assistance with. I'm happy to. I have tons of resources for everything you could think of. So if you like anything else, or if there are things that you know you feel you need more guidance on, that's totally fine. I'm happy to provide that. Just let me know. And with that, I will leave you to it. Have a great weekend. It's still snowing. I think it's just going to snow forever. It's supposed to snow through Sunday. So be safe, stay warm, and let me know if you have any questions. I will talk to you all in the coming days.